Hello and welcome to another episode of Nevermind the Dam Busters, the podcast dedicated to all things RAF Bomber Command, with me, James Jeffries, and my co-host, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. So today we're joined by writer, historian and broadcaster Daniel Knowles, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Daniel holds a joint honours degree in history and politics. Daniel's work includes Tirpitz, the life and death of Germany's last great battleship, HMS Hood, Pride of the Royal Navy, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and Empire Cruise, the Special Service Squadron 1923 to 1924. Hello, Daniel, and welcome to the show.
Hi, James. Hi, Jane. Thank you for the invite to be here. It's a pleasure.
Thanks very much for joining us, Daniel, and for giving up your Sunday afternoon. Now, I was quite excited to see that you'd written about Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Tirpitz. I'm currently doing a lot of research and writing about the Norwegian campaign, so I'm particularly interested in the Tirpitz raids as well. But my last book, which I've just finished writing, is about Bomber Command mine-laying operations, and obviously they were one of the few to actually hit the Scharnhorst of Gneisenau during the Channel Dash. So I'll be digging into your books about that. So as far as listeners are concerned, then, we've invited Daniel to come onto the show today to talk about some really thorny issues, and in particular, how the work of Bomber Command is viewed in cultural memory today. So we're going to be looking at how opinions of Bomber Command's role in the defeat of Germany have evolved over the years, and in particular the role that the Dresden raids have played in the popular understanding of Bomber Command and the influence of factors such as casualty figures upon the moral debate surrounding area bombing. There's plenty to get our teeth stuck into there. I think we could probably do an episode on each of those topics. So, Daniel, do you want to explain, first of all, a little bit about how you first became interested in Bomber Command?
Yeah, sure. So I first became interested in Bomber Command as first when I went into graduate dissertation. It was on changing perceptions to Bomber Command. And at the time, it was 2015, so almost 10 years ago. And that was 70 years since the Dresden raid, so there was a lot of stuff in the media, the bombing of Dresden, and so at the time, debate regarding the bombing of sort of terrorist group Islamic State and Britain's involvement in that. So there was debate in Parliament, and more of that just combined. I thought it was a very interesting study because it seemed to be the case that what was being discussed in 2015 regarding whether or not Britain should engage in the bombing of Islamic State all track back to the bombing of Dresden, the bombing of General in the Second World War.
We're having similar debates now as well, aren't we, about the situation in Ukraine and Russia as well. And I think that particularly sort of highlights in people's memory the idea and the concept of strategic bombing and the targeting of civilians in particular. So can we begin then by talking a little bit about how you see the historiography of Bomber Command sort of evolving, particularly where the historiography is now and what the current views and current debates are surrounding Bomber Command?
I just wonder if for viewers who might not be too familiar, do we want to explain quickly what historiography is?
Well, go on then, you're the academic.
Yes.
Do that.
Gosh, all right. I have this in my first years every year. Essentially, when I really simplify it, it's a history of the history. So it's how topics of Bomber Command over the years, there have been different perspectives, there have been different publications, shifts in understanding. So you might have memoirs that come out and then you have films and interpretations of those films and people having more of a focus on different events. That could be new sources coming out influencing it, but there's always a constant discussion. And the historiography is looking at that long historical discussion of that from, Is that good?
Yeah. So basically why the history books say what they say. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Right, off you go then, Daniel. Where would you say we are today in terms of the historiography then?
Well, I think we're in a focus archery pace in sort of the 21st century compared to when we were at the end of the Second World War and in the decades that followed. So in modern times, there's a lot of focus on commemoration and commemorating the sacrifice of German civilians and the deaths that were incurred during the bombing of Germany, but also there's the focus on Bomber Command sacrifices and commemorating the airmen who were lost on operations by German occupied that's a big change that has occurred. Arguably, a change has occurred with the fall of the Green Curtain.
Mhm.
So prior to that, the historiography was pretty hostile towards Bomber Command. And initially, there was the official publications of the Air War, and they were all by respected historians who were close to the government and put the official narrative what the plan of Germany achieved. It was only within the 60s that historians began to put their own views forward, and things gained traction then. And within that was the idea that the bomb was inherently bad, and I think a lot of that ties into things which were occurring at the time on Vietnam.
Yeah.
Historians were thinking that the bombing of Germany was bad. There was a lot of talk about Dresden being a destructive raid. And if you think of the language around that and being told that it's a destructive raid and the horrors of bombing, and all of a sudden seeing the images of American air power in Vietnam, dropping away upon B-52s, dropping what seemed to be an endless supply of bombs from their bomb base, it's easy to conjure up the image that what Bomber Command did, where it was putting out 700, 800 bombers at a time, was inherently wrong and bad.
I'd never thought about the Vietnam connection, actually. But yeah, there's very much a tendency to see or to view history through the lens of whatever events are current at the time, isn't there? I think Vietnam certainly fits into a way the Bomber Command was perhaps viewed, certainly in the... How do you think that kind of reflects itself in the popular culture of the time? So I'm thinking about things like film, TV, books, all of that sort of thing.
I think that reflects in a number of ways. So within the 1960s, you had Slaughterhouse-5, which was published by Vonnegut, which was very much anti-war, anti-bombing. And there's a film made about that, which, if you didn't read the book, then you had the film that you could go and see and you would witness the horrors of war. So I think in terms of film, we are on, never mind the Dam Busters, but this was a T film. It focused on a specific patient. You've got Barnes Moss at the beginning of the film, where you can hear sounds like 200, 300 aircraft flying over. He says, it sounds like another heavy raid, and that's implying that there's a heavy raid going up to Germany and there's going to be a city laid waste too. And he talks about his idea is to basically bring Germany to its knees by selective bombing.
He's in the air ministry, and he says, if we can burst the dams with one bomb, it saves the hundreds and thousands of bombs that are being bombed on factories and such like. So yeah, I think there is this idea that there is a separateness to the raid because of the technology used and the precision nature of the target. And what you say actually about sort of like the 1960s and Vietnam, of course, you do have the counterculture coming in with the messages of the summer of love and such like, which I think are kind of, I don't know, do you think they're influencing this reevaluation?
I think to a degree it does in part influence the reevaluation. I think in part as well, it's also Warguard.
Yeah.
Dresden became a focal point, and it was very much used by the Soviets as a propaganda tool to highlight everything that was fundamentally wrong with the West, and seeing the West got all barrack. Look what they did to Dresden. So to a degree, I think there was a bit of a rethink in terms of, yes, with the wasted Dresden, there was talk about upwards of 100,000 being killed. So I think it was an assessment of, did we read that many people? Are we truly barbaric? Like what the Soviets are saying, should we put a message that we're not barbarians? And I think in part that was manifested through things like the Dalbusters 6th and 4th Squadron, Mosquito Squadron. Were all films, and I think very similar nature of specialised units.
All the old films,
precision raids.
Yeah, and at least during the 60s, you get, I hate mentioning his name, but you get Irving's book as well. Does that sort of tied in with that at the time before he's obviously been discredited and denounced for his work? That still played an influence probably for about 20 years or so?
I think very much so, because Irving forwarded the idea that 100,000 people killed in the raid on Dresden, and he said at the time that until he wrote his book, no one in the West knew about the horrors of Dresden. Which not as much as people did know about Dresden, but I think it gave it a bit more focus that it had perhaps previously had. And I think when that's taken into the wider context of what was occurring at the time, and now, and I'm sort of just, I think it all contributed to a perfect storm.
And you've got Grayling's book as well. So Among the Dead Cities, that one. What was that? Was that 70s or 80s? Which, I mean, I think that one had a sort of massive influence at the time as well, didn't it? But then, of course, counter to that, you've got the evolving work of Richard Overy coming in, what's that, sort of late 80s, early 90s, and putting a different perspective on things altogether and saying, well, actually, perhaps this, this did have a purpose, and it did help to win the war to a degree. It had a very limited role, but it played a part. And perhaps the thinking was beginning to change and not come full circle, but perhaps going a little bit more in favour of Bomber Command. Would you say that's fair?
I'll say that is fair. I think it puts in here, well, there's two parts to the answer. As much as I think by the 70s and 80s and continuing through the 90s and 2000s, with more information being released.
Right.
Generally, government documents are held under lock and key for a period of, what was 40 years, it's now 20, I think. So I think by the time you get to the 80s, documents which had been under lock and key, like the Thunderclap Memorandum, were perhaps a bit more accessible. So I think, when you contrast the likes of Oslo Little Hearts, where like beginning the early 70s to Max Hastings at the end of the 70s, the same period, Hastings had a lot more access to documentation that perhaps Little Heart didn't. I think, well, there's a continual reassessment of what we wanted to achieve. And I think even today, no one is quite sure of what the goals were in terms of the bombing of Germany.
Yeah.
Harris, famously in 1942, on the chin, said that bombing that can never win the war. That his counter-argument is it's never been tried. And we'll see. So I think there's the idea of Harris thought that's Germany into suppression, and Germany and that is not worth the ruins of one British grenadier. But you contrast that with the idea of we need to bomb Germany to stop them effectively producing the weapons of war. It's the idea of, okay, let's target oil, let's target the transportation links. So within the different campaigns of the bombing war, it's all become huddled up in terms of what the actual strategic goal of bombing was.
Yeah, I think different people had different goals as well, didn't they? That was part of the problem. I think people bombing and what it could achieve in different ways. Obviously, Churchill is pushing it, isn't he? He's pushing Harris to do area bombing, and this is something we talked about with Alan Allport as well a few episodes ago. That it's not Harris who is creating the policy of area bombing. He is simply implementing the policy based on the orders and instructions that he is being given. And I think that's something which is often lost in that whole tying up of Harris with strategic bombing and its effects in the popular memory.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I think it has to be remembered that Harris became commander of the Bomber Command in 1942. The seat of the Boer War had long been stirred, and that Harris was, like your own, a recipient of a strategic force which could do untold damage, and which was going into a force which could be risk to Germany. And because of that, he's become associated forever with the one with Germany and the destruction of it all.
Yeah, particularly given Churchill's dumping of him at the end of the war as well, and his attempts to distance himself from the strategic bombing campaign which he himself had demanded, really.
I think that comes to my mind as well with Dresden, and maybe another reason why it is in the conscious collective memory of the bombing war especially is because of the memorandum that was withdrawn by Churchill and the political fallout. And I wondered if that might be a factor as well that contributes to it.
I think it does. I mean, Churchill, he was very much a proponent of bombing Germany, and everyone has read about or heard about their books which Harris put together, which were given to Churchill and the King was given a copy. But it has to be remembered that Churchill wasn't always predictable at the bombing of Germany. There's a story that he was showing a film taken in the aftermath of a raid from Germany, and entered those in the room with him and said, "Are we barbarians?" And the film questioned the bombing of Germany. It was reminded by the chiefs of staff. Look what the Germans did to Coventry, look what they've done to Adam and Wapsall and countless other places, and that's what put him at ease. And then, the bombing war continued, and he asked the air staff in, well, attended the Alta Conference for the plans for bombing the Germans in their retreat from Breslau, culminated at Dresden, and then afterwards thought, well, I shouldn't be associated with this.
One of the things which gets me, again, picking up on the Dresden point, is why there is so much attention on Dresden as opposed to, say, Hamburg, when there were many, many more casualties in the Hamburg raids of July 43. Why do you think that everyone is so focused on Dresden, or has it almost taken it on its own cultural and historical significance, sort of away from the wider discussion?
What the reason is behind the main focus on Dresden is the reported casualty figures and how close it was to the end of the war. All of the debate which just came up in the aftermath of the war has been to say, well, there was anywhere between 75,000 and 100,000 if we look at the 1960s. I guess if you killed between 75,000 and 100,000 people in one city alone, that was terrible. But what makes it worse was you did it in February 1945. The war ended on the 8th of May. I think it's certainly during the war, no one thought about it in that context, because by February,
they didn't know when the war was going to end, did they? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's it. January hits the end of the Battle of the Bulge, so Germany was still viewed as being a credible threat, and the Rhine wouldn't be crossed until March. So, Germany was still very much a force to be reckoned with, and after that, it was Japan to deal with. So, I think all the debate, it's what we bring it out of proportion. But it didn't help that at the time. And briefing given by the chief intelligence officer, which said that and the purposes behind it was not only centres in the industries there, but also to cause terror amongst the refugees to the east. And that the Associated Press managed to spread that communique, which around the world said that Allied air commanders had finally adopted a policy of deliberate terrorization. And that word was key, because terrorization implied that all of a sudden the Allies were there simply to terrorize the civilian population, to cause them great fear and sort of crush the morality of the war that the Allies have been fighting, the two. And I think you're saying that even as the Allies came out and said there's been real change in bombing policy, by that point the cat was out of the bag. People
latch on to particular aspects of stories, don't they? And then those aspects sort of evolve and take on their own life, if you like. As far as the Dresden casualty figures are concerned, the actual figure is believed to be somewhere between 25 and 40,000. Is that right? Of casualties, which again is a lot less than were killed in Hamburg. Doesn't make it any less awful, but it's certainly a lot less than the figures that were being bandied about at the time and many years later as well.
I think that's what the norm was with, that was the problem with Dresden, but it's the problem with Germany more generally, is no one's quite sure on the casualty figures. I mean, it's certain that the raid on Dresden killed somewhere between, I think the latest estimates put it between 18,000 and 25,000.
So it's lower still.
It's far less than 40,000, which was killed in Hamburg during this two Firestorm raids, July 43. Well, I think what hasn't helped is, you had the Germans put forward the idea that potentially 250,000, because Goebbels was given a figure of 25,000 in Mexico Zero. Irving in the 60s put forward 100,000, and since then, various historians and even the popular press have put forward different figures of between 75,000, 100,000. It's been comparisons between Dresden and Hiroshima, and the idea that Dresden kills more people than the nuclear bombings. I think bottle bombing is no one sure about how many were killed in the way the bombing Germany more generally.
Yeah.
That figures.
That's it. I think it's really important not to focus just on one particular raid or one particular city.
No.
You've got to try and view it as a whole and put it in its wider context of what's going on generally. I mean, there are people being killed all over Europe by various means at this point in time, not just by aerial bombing. And I think that's something which is often forgotten. We tend to try to, it's just human nature, I don't know, but we tend to compartmentalize things, don't we? And it's so difficult to try and see things by way of the broader picture of what's going on the continent generally, I think.
I think with the wider memory, we say we remember just Dresden. The other side of that is also the Dam Busters raid. To mention it again, klaxon alert everybody. It does seem to be those two different prevailing memories, certainly collectively and publicly. And that's just to sell the podcast to anyone who might be listening to us. So that's what we want to do. We want to talk about those, have these wider, more rounded discussions, because there is still lots to discuss, and understanding, and certainly a big part of my PhD thesis, just to plug mine, is understanding where certain things are remembered more than others, which I think is important, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it.
I think another fundamental issue that has to be looked at is the way in which bomber command and campaign against Germany is contrasted with the American campaign against Germany.
Yeah.
And the Americans maintained that they engaged in a precision bombing campaign, and that they only hit specific targets, but it has to be taken with a pinch of salt to a degree. And there was an American Air Force colonel that had a seminar in the post-war period looking at the bombing of Germany more generally, and he came out with a rather unique claim where he said that Bomber Command engaged in precision bombing against area targets, whereas the US Army Air Force engaged in area bombing at precision targets. To a degree, that is right. I mean, you've got Stephen Holland, respected American Air Force historian, he said that American aircrews then come take the broad side of a bomb, and that on average, the aircrews dropping their bodies was 1,200 feet of the aiming point, which is a significant margin of error. And when you think of the box formations that their postal bombs are going to be spread over a wide area, so what is the difference between an American precision bombing raid and my bomber command's city busting raids?
Yeah. I think one thing that people perhaps aren't conscious of is that, yes, people talk about the Northern Bomb site and what have you, but the precision bombing, what we would think about precision bombing today, you see all these Russian and Ukrainian attacks, or even going back to the Gulf Wars and sort of Iraq and what have you. What we think about precision bombing, following a missile basically down someone's chimney, it just didn't exist in those days. The technology just wasn't there. You just couldn't do it. And I think perhaps our view of what precision bombing means today has coloured how we think of what precision bombing should have been in the 1940s. And it just wasn't that.
Well, that's a very valid point. I mean, if you compare the Lancaster to the modern fighter Type 4, you're comparing apples with apples, exactly. You've got a very robust but mundane aircraft against a top of the range, £300 million aircraft, which that's one can buy some of the best technology in the world as it is today, against what was arguably the best technology in the 1940s, but is fairly primitive by today's standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're dropping a £4,000 cookie against a £4,000 laser guided bomb.
It's just no comparison, is there? No comparison at all. Can I touch on how you think aircrew themselves have been represented over the years since the war, and also about how their own particular stories have been heard across both sort of in fiction, but in fact in the history books as well.
So clear that the aircrews themselves in the years since the war have been unfairly treated, and the treatment that they've received has been largely unjust. They were, at the end of the day, following orders. Now, I am aware that that does open up the idea of the Nuremberg defence, if you want to mess the idea of them being war criminals and the bombing generally being a war crime. But the bombing war was very impersonal, and it has to be remembered that the men who served in Bomber Command were all volunteers. And what's often forgotten is the casualty rate. There was 55,000 men killed. They had a worse chance of surviving in Bomber Command than they did as an officer in the trenches during the First Month.
Yeah.
The Germans very much viewed themselves as hitting back at Germany. They didn't see the faces of women and children. It was just a big landscape and often a bunch of falling fires. When you find out that you couldn't exactly see what you're hitting, if you're unfortunately made to see the main streets through the fire, but otherwise, you're on with flames, which
I think a lot of them obviously were aware of what they were doing because they'd seen what the sharp end of strategic bombing could achieve in this country. Blitz, London, Manchester, Sheffield, Glasgow, Hull, Newcastle, even everywhere up and down the country. So I think it's perhaps not right to suggest that that they just kind of went into this almost in a robot-like state, and just dropped the bombs and didn't think about what they're doing. I think each man perhaps had a different view of what he was required to do and what the results of his actions would be. Some of them, it didn't bother them at all. They thought that they were doing the right thing. But others, I think they really, really were concerned by what they were doing and what the end result of their particular actions were. And I know, talking to some of the aircrew that I've met and interviewed over the years, some of them continue to be very troubled by what was actually happening on the ground, I think. But again, others equally were like, well, we were just doing a job. We did it because we had to. It helped bring about the end of the war. I don't think we can, how can I phrase this? I don't think we can just group everyone together and say, oh, they were just doing a job. They all, thought this or thought that. I think it's very, very nuanced as to how we should approach that. And, to portray everyone as, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like machines, just, delivering these bombs, coming home again and not thinking about what was actually happening on the ground, I think is perhaps not right. What would your view on that be, Daniel?
I think you made some valid points in the rule. Aircrew have expressed their roles equally as those that have turned around and said that at the end of the day, they were bombing Germany, and their attitudes to a degree have been Germany started it, they're going to finish it. I think, well, it all depends on who was being bombed. As much as there was a lot more resistance to the bombing of France, for example, and potential collateral damage than there was into the bombing of Germany. A lot of debate was in Allied circles about bombing occupied territories as opposed to bombing Germany. So I think all of that factored in. And I think as well, you have the benefit of hindsight, still change, thoughts change. I mean, you can speak with veterans or watch documentaries and whatnot. Opinions have changed, thoughts have changed. And I think
that's a valid point.
Thing.
People's views do definitely change. Yeah. I know that I've mentioned this before in one of our earlier episodes, but one of the crews that I've done a lot of work on, the skipper was quite a religious man. And he actually used to pray for the German people before every raid. Now, I think that's perhaps quite unusual and quite an extreme, but I think it's an illustration of that nuance, if you like, that I've been talking about just there. Is there anything else that you want to mention, James, or any of the questions that you want to mention, Daniel?
I'm quite interested because, we're talking about memory and such like and commemoration. What the whole debate and topic of memorials for Bomber Command is one that I've talked about in talks and looked at. And I think that the first National Memorial 2012, which was crowdfunded, before that you'd had the Arthur Harris statue 1992, met with the protests and such like. Do you think that's also being influenced by these wider discussions, and also have they in themselves influenced the discussion? So there's kind of like this two-pronged influence, both on each other with the wider memory, and how this story is kind of memorialized and how people come to terms with it.
I think so. With the House Memorial, it seemed to be that the Parkland Association was commemorating a man who had done untold death and destruction to get with human beings, and that we should be vilified for that. We should commemorate it. I think it didn't help that the memorial when it was unveiled by the Queen Mother. It was unveiled on the 31st of May, 82, which was 50 years since the bombing of Culloden, which created a bit more of feeling, shall we say. It was perhaps necessary. And I think, that debate, because in the 1980s, it was still very much time when bomber command was out of favour. And the bombing of Germany was very much still questioned. Well, it became odd too much memory of bomber command. Then we got to the bomber command article. There had been various reasons put forward over the years for why bomber command shouldn't be honoured with various memorials, why they should get a campaign medal. It becomes hard all of a sudden trying to crowdfund to create memorials, and it's gaining traction to come out and sort of oppose that. The government, if they try.
And I think that the concept, as you say, of the living memory of the veterans now disappearing, so to speak. We've seen it with the First World War. You do have the last Tommies in books and in documentaries and such like, and I think we're going to be approaching that with the Second World War as well. And I think because of that First World War experience, it's now happening with the Second World War, like you say, we must have this memorial, we must do this and try and do that.
You can't force people to remember or commemorate stuff, though. That's the thing. And, well, I don't want to get into the whole sort of poppy debate and copygate and poppy watch and all that nonsense. Absolutely. But there's almost that it's almost like gone too much the other way, I think, and people are sort of almost forced into these commemorations. I think it's got to be a personal choice ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, you can't force people to commemorate as well. With Bomber Command, it's important to recognise the sacrifice, because before that, you got various RAF memorials which go around the Britain. You've got the Dowding statue, you've got the Bargate Memorial down in Dover. There's little, I can't remember what the memorial is called, where there's various different names of airmen listed who are missing because you've been killed.
Runnymede.
Thank you very much. Even in National Bomber Command Centre, there's more of a national focus. It doesn't just focus on Bomber Command as you see it as being sort of British squadrons, but it's also there to commemorate the sacrifice of German civilians, French civilians, various different nationalities which served with the command.
I think they do a brilliant job as well. They've got the balance there, I think, just in terms of commemoration and respect, and it's absolutely spot on, I think. They've done a brilliant job. Thank you very much, Daniel, for that really, really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I think that there's so much more there that we could have gone into, and definitely some further episodes, I think, will arise out of that discussion. So coming up then, in our next episode, we're going to be talking to Dr. Dan Ellen of the International Bomber Command Centre and the University of Lincoln. We've had Dan on the show before. He's absolutely fantastic. And Mary Brazier about the RAF's notorious lack of moral fibre policy, and about the treatment of psychiatric casualties generally within Bomber Command and within the RAF. So I'm really looking forward to that one. It should be a really, really interesting discussion.
As always, do give us a follow on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram, and please continue to send in your questions. We love hearing from them. We always have absolutely brilliant questions and comments from you. Now, Jane and I are hoping to increase the frequency of our shows to once a week, but to do that, we really do need your help. You can lend your support by becoming a paid subscriber for as little as $3, around £2.40. Just hit the subscribe button on our webpage at Nevermind the Damn Busters. www.buzzsprout.com, all lowercase, or please click on the link on the show notes which accompany every episode. This really does help keep the pod going and is greatly appreciated. We'll be organising some more live streams as well for our paid subscribers shortly.
Yes, and please do leave a review or star rating wherever you get your podcasts. That really does make a difference and really helps us. So thank you for listening once again, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye.